$18 million. That's what I inherited in 1977, a small, forgettable mutual fund at Fidelity called Magellan that almost nobody in the building thought was worth paying attention to. 13 years later, when I walked away from it, that same fund held over $14 billion. Do the math on that if you want, but I'll save you the trouble. It's not a good year. It's not a good decade. It's one of the greatest runs in the history of professional money management, and I averaged close to 29% a year doing it, beating the S&P 500 in 11 of those 13 years. But here's what almost nobody asks me, and it's the question that actually matters. How does a kid whose father died when he was 10, who paid his way through school carrying golf bags, end up running the most famous mutual fund on the planet? That's not a resume. That's a story. And I want to walk you through the whole thing, the parts people quote and the parts they usually skip. Because the ending everybody knows, walking away at 46 at the absolute peak of my career, doesn't make sense unless you understand everything that came before it. My father died of cancer when I was 10 years old. He was a mathematics professor, and after he passed, my mother had to go to work to keep our family afloat. I picked up a job caddying at a golf course outside Boston called Bray Burn, and I want to be honest with you about why that job mattered so much, because it wasn't the money, even though the money helped. It was the education nobody else my age was getting. The men I carried bags for were CEOs, investors, presidents of companies, and I spent every one of those afternoons listening to them talk about stocks between holes. I wasn't hired to talk. I was hired to listen. And I listened carefully enough that by the time I was in college at Boston College, studying history and philosophy, not finance, I'd already picked up enough to make my very first real investment on my own, in a small airline called Flying Tiger, at around $7 a share. The Vietnam War escalated not long after. The military needed a fast way to move troops and cargo overseas, and Flying Tiger ended up carrying a good part of that demand. That stock eventually climbed past $80 a share, and the profits from it helped pay my way through my MBA at Wharton. So before I ever set foot inside Fidelity as an employee, I'd already lived the exact lesson that would define my entire career. One good idea, backed by actual homework, can change everything, even for a broke college kid with nothing but a hunch worth chasing down properly. One of the men I'd caddied for turned out to be the president of Fidelity, and that connection is how, at 25 years old, I landed a job as a research analyst there, initially covering unglamorous industries like textiles and metals. Not the kind of assignment that makes headlines, but it taught me to read a balance sheet before I ever learned to fall in love with a stock. I put in 2 years of military service in between, and by 1977, Fidelity handed me the keys to Magellan. $18 million, a fund small enough that barely anyone was watching what I did with it, which, in hindsight, might have been the best possible situation for me. Nobody was looking over my shoulder. I could go find ideas nobody else had bothered to research yet. And honestly, that early obscurity turned out to be one of the biggest advantages of my entire career, because it gave me years to build a process before anyone was paying close enough attention to second-guess it. And that's exactly what I did obsessively. I've said before that the person who turns over the most rocks wins this game, and that's always been my philosophy, not as a slogan, but as a literal description of how I spent my days. I visited hundreds of companies a year. I ran meetings with a 3-minute egg timer to keep executives focused and honest. I found ideas everywhere ordinary people already had access to, not in some private research department. My wife Carolyn came home talking about a new brand of pantyhose from Hands called L-Eggs, sold right there at the grocery store checkout line, and I went and researched the actual business behind it before buying a share. My own kids wouldn't stop talking about Taco Bell, and that observation turned into real research before it ever turned into a position in the fund. Dunkin' Donuts, Stop and Shop, La Quinta Motor Inns, Pep Boys, Dozens of ordinary, unglamorous businesses that most of Wall Street considered too boring to bother with. I wasn't smarter than the analysts covering flashier industries. I was just willing to look in places they'd already decided weren't worth their time. But if you want the single moment that actually built my reputation, the one that turned Magellan from a promising fund into a legend, you have to go back to 1982, and it starts, strangely enough, with me researching a completely different company. I was digging into Ford when I stumbled across Chrysler, and at the time, Chrysler's stock was trading at around $2 a share, because most of Wall Street had already written the company off as a bankruptcy waiting to happen. Everybody assumed it was finished. I went and looked closer anyway, and what I found didn't match the panic in the headlines. The company had roughly $1 billion in cash sitting on its books, and a significant chunk of its debt was backed by loans the federal government had guaranteed. I spent a full day out at their offices talking with the people actually running the business, including Lee Iacocca, and came away convinced there was a real turnaround here, not just wishful thinking. They had new cars coming, and Iacocca was especially excited about something the auto industry hadn't really seen before, a vehicle that would eventually become the minivan. I bought as much Chrysler as regulations allowed, 5% of the entire fund, the maximum the SEC would let me hold, and I would have gone higher if they'd let me. It doubled in the first 8 months alone. Not long after, I was invited onto a PBS show called Wall Street Week with Lee Iacocca, and that appearance turned out to be the moment my name started reaching people well beyond the finance industry. Chrysler alone eventually turned into roughly a 15-bagger, and it became the story people told about me for years afterward. From there, the fund just kept growing and growing and growing until it became something almost nobody had planned for, the largest mutual fund in the world. And I want to be honest about the mid-1980s, because that stretch wasn't just smooth sailing. There was a real chorus of critics who insisted Magellan had simply grown too large to keep performing the way it had, that a fund that size couldn't possibly stay nimble enough to beat the market the way a smaller fund could. It's a fair criticism on paper. Most fund managers, once they're sitting on billions instead of millions, end up concentrating into a smaller handful of enormous, safe positions simply because there aren't enough genuinely undervalued small companies to fill that much money without moving the price against yourself. I took the opposite approach. Instead of narrowing down, I widened out. At the fund's peak, I was holding well over 1,000 different stocks at once, an amount that would have seemed almost reckless to a lot of traditional portfolio theory, because conventional wisdom said diversification like that just guarantees you'll end up with mediocre, market-average returns. But I never treated all 1,000 of those positions equally. Most of them were small stakes, ideas I'd researched enough to have real conviction in but hadn't yet earned a larger allocation, while a much smaller core of positions, the Chryslers, the Fannie Mees, the true fast growers I had the highest conviction in, carried the real weight of the fund's performance. Fannie Mae is worth mentioning on its own, because it shows this approach wasn't only about consumer brands people recognized from the mall. That position came from sitting down with the actual filings of a mortgage finance company, understanding how the business made money and what its risk profile really looked like, and recognizing the market had priced it wrong. It became one of the largest holdings in the fund for a stretch, and nobody stumbles onto a position like that by shopping on a Saturday afternoon. Some ideas came from my own life. Others came from nothing more than a willingness to read something nobody else wanted to bother with. I actually coined a word for what happens when this goes wrong, when a company or an investor keeps adding more and more positions or acquisitions that have nothing to do with what they actually understand, just to feel diversified. I called it diworsification, and avoiding it, even while holding 1,000 names, meant every single position still had to earn its place through real homework, not just get added to pad the number. I'll tell you honestly, those critics probably kept me on the job an extra 4 or 5 years longer than I would have stayed otherwise, because they got my Irish up, and I wanted to prove them wrong more than I wanted to slow down. In 1989, my last full year at the helm, the fund returned 34.5%. Not a quiet, cautious final lap. One of the best years of the entire run, right before I walked away. So let's get to the part of this story that surprises people the most, because everyone assumes a run like mine ends with burnout, a bad year, a scandal, something dramatic. Mine ended because of a soccer game in the rain. I remember standing there watching my daughter play and thinking, I want to see more of these. That's not a metaphor I'm dressing up for a video. That's genuinely how it hit me. My own father had died of cancer at almost the exact same age I was approaching, and somewhere in the middle of running the largest fund in the world, flying constantly, visiting companies, spending every spare hour buried in research, I asked myself a question that stopped me cold. What the hell are we doing this for? I love the work. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes assume I walked away resentful, and that's not true. I loved it. But I came to a conclusion I couldn't unhear once I'd heard it. I didn't know a single person on their deathbed who wished they'd spent more time at the office. So in March of 1990, at 46 years old, at the absolute height of my career, I announced I was retiring, citing my health and wanting to spend real time with my family. Over 1,000 letters came in afterward from people, most of whom I'd never met, thanking me for making a choice most people in my position never have the courage to make. Now here's the twist in this story that I think matters more than any of the numbers I've thrown at you so far, and it's the part that should genuinely unsettle you if you're only paying attention to the headline return. Fidelity actually studied what happened to the ordinary investors who put money into Magellan during my 13 years running it. The real people buying and selling shares of the fund itself, not the fund's underlying performance. And what they found was almost impossible to believe on the surface. A meaningful share of those investors actually lost money during a stretch when the fund itself was compounding at nearly 29% a year. How does that happen? It happens because people chase performance. The fund had incredible years, up 70% in 1980 alone at one point, and money flooded in right after headlines like that, from people trying to catch a wave that had already crested. Then a rough stretch would follow, and those same people would panic and pull their money out, locking in a loss right before the recovery arrived. The fund wasn't the problem. Their own behavior was, and I've spent a large part of my career since retirement trying to make that single point stick, because it's arguably more valuable than any stock pick I ever made. You only need a few good stocks in your lifetime to do extraordinarily well, but you need discipline in every single year to actually hold on to them long enough to matter. I stayed involved with Fidelity in an advisory role after I stepped back from day-to-day management, and I spent a lot of the years that followed writing, trying to hand people the actual process rather than just the highlight reel of the returns. Because the number everybody remembers, $18 million turning into $14 billion, was never really the lesson worth learning. Anyone can admire a number on a chart. Far fewer people are willing to do what actually produced it, visiting hundreds of companies a year, running meetings on an egg timer to keep myself honest about how much time I was wasting, and treating every single idea, no matter how boring or unglamorous it looked on the surface, as something worth actually investigating before I trusted it with real money. So when people ask me how I turned $18 million into $14 billion, I understand why they want a formula, a checklist, a secret. And there is a real process underneath it, the research, the categories I sorted every stock into, the discipline to buy more of a good company when the market panicked instead of less. But if I'm being completely honest with you, the harder part of this story was never the picking. It was the holding, both for me and especially for the people who invested alongside me. Finding Chrysler at $2 a share required curiosity and homework. Holding it through the doubt required conviction. And walking away in 1990, at the very top, required something almost nobody in this industry ever manages to find: the willingness to admit that the number in your fund's return was never actually the point. My daughter's soccer game in the rain was the point. The $14 billion was just what happened while I was busy chasing a much simpler idea: turn over enough rocks, do the actual homework, and let the good ones run. And if there's one thing I'd want you to carry away from this whole story, it's that the two halves of it were never actually separate. The discipline that let me sit through a rough quarter on Chrysler without flinching is the exact same discipline that let me walk away from 14B.